Maximize your peace by stepping into your power, and you don't need to know it all up front. That's Jesse Prejean's take on how to live a better life, and he's got the story to back it up.
After about 8 years of struggling with addiction, I went to get help.
He's a spiritual life coach, and his deep insight into consciousness began with finding his own peace. Now his clients feel secure knowing he's experienced the shadow self too.
Something that I will do for foreseeably the rest of my life.
His story teaches you that you are not broken and that you have the peace and love already, so why not recognize it?
You have a spiritual disease, and if you don't follow our rules, you're screwed. I don't need to do anything to experience the divine.
Awaiting you is all that and more, including wisdom on opening up and realizing our spiritual reality on this episode of Angels Around Us.
This podcast does not replace the mainstream medical system. If you or someone you know are in need of physical or mental help, please consult a trained medical professional.
Walk us through your journey. What brought you to today?
I like to start out by saying I had always been a highly sensitive child. I was very different than the rest of my family in how I responded to things. I was a little bit isolated in a way because I felt like it was a way to protect myself, because I was so sensitive to things, but also the way I internalized the world seemed very different than the way other people did. Other people seemed to just be able to carry on with their lives after maybe a triggering experience. But for me, it just rattled my world, you know? So I even had experiences that I recall from, probably the age of 5 to 8 years old. I was experiencing this feeling of expansion, and it would always happen as I'm lying in bed. I would close my eyes and suddenly feel just the enormity of all that was. And suddenly that feeling would contrast into like a singular point. And so this would happen constantly. I didn't honestly know what to think. It felt kind of normal in a way, but I never shared it with anyone because no one else talked about it. I was experiencing that on like a nightly basis. And years later into adulthood, I had shared it with my mom, and she was like, wow, I experienced the same thing too. And so did your grandfather. And so that's when I started to get curious about lineage too, and like how those things kind of come down genetically.
Do you know if anyone else in your family went into this field of like specifically being a spiritual practitioner, or have they all kind of led quote unquote normal lives?
None of them really went into the field, but tracing back to my great grandmother, she was very gifted. I never met her, but the stories I heard, she would always claim she had gifts, but she was also someone who was diagnosed as schizophrenic, which I think oftentimes happens. I believe she was gifted, but had trouble really grounding that into reality. And then some of my family members in Cajun culture, there was this little kind of weaving in of magic. I call like gypsy magic, because the Cajuns were kind of gypsies before they came back around to Louisiana. So there was a bit of that in there. And then my mom was just a very intuitive woman. And she, when I was growing up, would mention that around her college years, she began to be able to visually see people's energy fields. And so it was there. And I think some people in my family may have been living kind of this really spiritual way, but not necessarily in the healing arts. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
So going back to, you were talking about this to your mother, right? This feeling of expansion, which I have definitely experienced too. I feel like that's sort of a commonality with a lot of different folks that are working for the highest good, right? This feeling of pure consciousness. But don't let me distract from what you were saying.
No, that's a great way to describe it too. Yeah, it is this feeling of pure consciousness. And that went on for years. I remember as I got older, probably sometime around 12, 13, I would find myself in this deep space of introspection, in a sense, trying to connect with that space again. Like I knew it was there, like I could sense on some level that there was something greater than me that I was part of and I could tap into. But my thoughts wouldn't let me get there. And I would be in my room, just frustrated and in tears, like, what is this? How do I connect with this? And that went on, periodically for some time too. And looking back after getting to where I am today, I can see these small bits of evidence of kind of this pattern that had already been there. This ability to tap into this space had always been with me. I was aware of it, but it wasn't until I got older that I had some life experience that was my kind of awakening trigger. Fast forward, I guess, to college. I had my first involuntary out-of-body experience, which was kind of another trigger moment for me. I got my scholarship to LSU, and I was going into biochemical engineering because it was the hot career choice at the time. And I remember going through, I think it was my second semester or something like that, and just being overwhelmed with these crazy like engineering physics classes. And it was coming up to finals week, and I had an emotional breakdown. Like I couldn't take that load anymore and that stress. And I had a meltdown. That was the first time in my life I ever felt that defeated. And later that night, I was staying at my aunt's house. She happened to live near campus, so I would stay with her every now and again. And I was going to bed. I laid my head on the pillow, and the moment I turned my head, I was out of my body. And I was floating above my body, and I was very conscious, very aware. It was not a dream state, and I was able to kind of manipulate my surroundings and move, and I was very much in control of that experience. And that got me questioning more. Like at that time in my life, I started to go, wow, something else more is going on here that like I can participate in. And something about being out of body also felt really natural. It felt like I had done this before.
Can I ask a quick question? Like I've heard before that state kind of feels like more real than living in this world. Does that resonate with what your experience was like?
I would say to some degree, because yeah, there is that sense of home. There's a sense of familiarity that I don't think I've ever experienced in my body before. It almost felt like my body was this foreign thing, but this is where I've kind of always meant to be in a way. So in that regard, yeah.
Right.
After having that experience, I started to get a lot more curious just about consciousness in general. I had some experience with meditation before, and, as circumstances had it, I ended up getting a job couple of years later at Whole Foods Market, and I met some really great people there who were really instrumental in kind of helping me with resources and things. And I read this book that I was introduced to. It's called You Forever by Lobsang Rampa, and it's essentially a how to have an out-of-body experience guide. And so I read the book, and I started to learn how to induce this state for myself. And it was really easy for me. It felt really natural. And so that's where I kind of shifted into realizing I can kind of take this into my own hands and start exploring consciousness.
Can I ask if that technique has anything to do with like a controlled breath work? It's funny you mentioned around like age 13, 14 for you, because for me, that was around the time where I started to get really interested in consciousness too. Lucid dreaming, astral projection, a lot of similar notes that we touched on in that journey. And so for me, the vibration that was amplified was really through breath work. Did you utilize anything like that in that experience?
Not in those techniques. What I was taught, and is very similar to what Robert Monroe, who is a well-known explorer of consciousness, he has these techniques where you kind of entrain yourself to shift consciousness into what we call the mind awake, body asleep state. And it's not necessarily done by breath work. It's more of just a letting go, a kind of relaxation technique where you deepen the relaxation of your body enough to where you can intentionally start to move your energy away from the body and ultimately create that separation. And so for a lot of people, what they say it's like is a sensation of floating, and then a sound, which a lot of people say sounds like a train coming, And then there's the release. For me, it was suddenly would dip out of consciousness and then come back as my out of body self. So it was kind of like a blink moment, and then the shift would happen.
That's really cool. I could just say for the lucid dreaming techniques that I was using, one of the techniques they did was called finger induced lucid dreaming, which is where you like wiggle the first two fingers very, very gently as your body is going to sleep. So it's kind of like that's another process to keep the mind awake and active while the body is going to sleep. That period of time, that was pretty much all throughout your college years for you. Has that basically been the course between then and now, or has anything changed? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, a lot changed from those experiences into kind of what I've come into. Around that time, I was very kind of stepping into this rebellion from life, and I quit school and I just kind of wanted to do my own thing. You know, I was a musician and I was really loving that aspect of life. I eventually became addicted to alcohol and substances, and that kind of took precedence over everything in my life. And so I spent a good portion of time really in a struggle with that. I would have periods of where I would come to, in a sense, and come conscious again, and then roll back into those dependency patterns. And so that was my first really deep struggle in life, and which was ultimately the path that led me to my awakening to energy and spirit in the most profound way. So after about 8 years or so struggling with alcoholism and addiction, I went to get help, and I went into a treatment center. During my stay there, I started to have experiences with energy involuntarily. I'll just kind of describe a couple of them that were really notable for me. There were periods of time after the first week that I was in treatment where I would start to feel tingling in the head, and I would feel energy kind of coming into my body through the crown. And I would get this really peaceful kind of high feeling from it. It felt so good. And I just embraced that. After a few days of having this repeatedly happen, there was one day where I was experiencing this flood of energy through the crown. And in a moment, this energy kind of settled in my heart space and then burst open. It felt like if someone hooked up a fire hose to the back of your chest and just cranked it on, and there was energy just blasting through my body, and it was a feeling I've never felt before, and it felt just like this unconditional, pure love. And, you know, I cried and just embraced the experience. Probably lasted a good 10, 15 minutes. It was pretty intense. And now after my studies, I realized I had a heart chakra opening. The second experience that I'll always remember, and it was probably a few days after the heart opening, I was having this flood of energy through the crown again, and I decided I'm just going to go for a walk on the property. And as I'm walking around, I felt a surge of energy kind of pulse through my body. And this one felt like if someone plugged you into a wall socket. I felt a current of energy coming through my body, a tingling, a vibration, and this energy moved out of my physical body into my auric field, and I could sense this tingling reaching out a few feet. And then the next thing I know, I could feel this energy just coursing through the palms of my hands. I was blown away, completely blown away by this experience. And I was like giving myself this energy, and I could feel it. It was such a palpable experience. And I had a moment of thought where I said, I have to kind of show somebody this to make sure I'm not crazy. Mm-hmm. And I went into the room I was staying in, and I had a roommate in there, and he was sitting in his room writing. So I went up to him, asked him to hold his palms out. And when he did, I placed my palms over his, and there was this exchange of energy that was happening. And we both kind of looked at each other in amazement. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I have no idea, but I think I'm giving you energy." And so that was another validating moment for me that, you know, it wasn't just a subjective experience, that this energy I'm tapping into, it was something very real. So that was my huge kind of awakening, so to speak, and coming out of that really, really significant shadow period of my life and awakening to this whole new experience of what reality is.
I would love to focus in on some of the details there. A lot of the people that I spoke with talk about this opportunity that this darker period in our lives sometimes offers to like springboard into this beautiful new place. So like from that dark energy, the shadow self, it's almost like a canvas for you to paint this new beautiful, like you can't experience the highs of the highs unless you experience the lows of the lows. And so going back to why this happened for you, do you think this was sort of orchestrated out before you came into this life? Like, okay, I'm going to go through this period of substance and alcohol abuse to allow you to springboard into this new, beautiful healing era that you're in?
Great question. I believed that to be true. But I also think a lot of what I experienced in my life was still based in choice, but a lot of the conditions that I experienced growing up in, it was easy to make those choices because, and I know this from working with a lot of sensitives and empaths, that there isn't a lot of support for that disposition. Coming into a world that is conditioned the way it is, it makes it really difficult to know the best choice for us individually. It's just so easy to say, I'm just going to blot this and numb this out because I don't know what to do with it. And no one else around me knows what to do with it. So
you're talking about the empathic people, right?
Yeah, exactly. The hypersensitivity. And so it just makes sense to me now. I think as conditions were, whether it was something on a soul level, I decided, let's go for it. Let's do this. Or, I can see both sides. I'll say that.
So maybe it was more like a coping mechanism?
Most definitely. And I see how deep these patterns have run in myself and other people who have that, similar disposition and conditioning. And it's one of those things that, actually takes some work and conscious effort to move through these patterns, to find healthier ways to exist in this world. And what I see is to kind of step outside of the box and do different things and figure out what works for you so that you can be healthy and happy in this life.
So take us back to that point where you had this blow open moment during your time in this rehab facility, working through this massive shift in energy that you were experiencing. You were describing the energy flowing into your crown, through your heart, into your auric field. From that point onwards, there seems to be a clear progression from then until now where you're helping people heal. So take us through that process and also describe, like, did you try and seek out any support with opening up these gifts and enhancing them and building upon that?
Well, I was really lucky, or divinely orchestrated, in the sense that things were accessible to me. So in the treatment center, there were two women who worked as therapists or something like that, but they had a great deal of experience and knowledge when it came to the metaphysical world. And so I already had people to talk to that were like, yeah, what you're experiencing is real. And they were validating me and kind of giving me direction. And one of them happened to be a Reiki master teacher. And so after the experience with the energy in my palms, she helped me kind of connect dots with Reiki. And I was like, I need to learn this. This is a really important piece for me. And so that was the first thing. Right when I got out of treatment, I found a Reiki master and I was off. So that was the first thing. As far as finding support and starting to build my spiritual toolkit, my tool belt, that's directly where I went. And it was the right choice for me.
I'm sure there were a lot of ups and downs and some periods of maybe doubt too, right?
For a while, it was, to be honest, it was hard to doubt it because that time in my life, it just felt so strong. It was like, there was no way you could tell me this wasn't real. And so I was off to the races. And I think after a while, once I started to make it kind of a practice, then that's when things started to come in a little bit. And then my shadow stuff would come into and all that. So that's when I realized I had work to do while I do this work.
Right. And so this journey for you definitely has a lot of shadow work involved. I mean, I know you help people with their shadow work. This is a lot of what healers are here to do, right? Is help kind of filter that out and learn and grow and just release what's not our true selves. So walk us through some shadow work that maybe you had to do. I know during this period for you of substance and alcohol abuse, coping really feeds into the desire to want to abuse things and maybe sort of escape from this world, right? So kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, that's a big part of my story. And I think still is and continues to be something that I will do for foreseeably the rest of my life. So I have a lot to look forward to. A lot of what I've worked through has been kind of this core dependency stuff, and that shows up in so many different patterns and cycles, and the people pleasing thing, and really learning to come into my own power. People pleasing was one of the first things I had to work on, and I'm glad I did. It really started to help me see that, you know, my personal power is also very much a gift, and it's very much connected to source and my sense of being, and just being able to really live out my life in a way that's in alignment with me. So connecting to my sense of power was really important. And then realizing after that, starting to see these really kind of more subtle, energetic ways that I would still not embrace that power, and starting to look at resolving those things when it came to relationship codependency, food, whatever. I mean, there's so many ways that this pattern showed up for me. And another piece of the puzzle that I had to resolve too was when I got sober, I participated in 12-step programs, and I did that for a long time. And within that realm, I realized after years of participating that there was still this sense of codependency happening, and that it was being reinforced by a lot of the belief systems that are taught in those programs. And so that was another layer I had to peel back. And once I did, I really kind of deepened this sense of personal responsibility and power, what I would call spiritual autonomy, so to speak. So those are kind of some core things that I've had to work out.
Thank you. Thank you. I do want to circle back on the 12-step programs that you talked about, because I have had family members that have been in those programs too. So I know a little bit, but before I get into that, you mentioned like rediscovering this sense of power. I take it to mean like that's your willpower and your power to overcome these lessons in these shadow selves, right? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, I believe the power that I'm able to tap into, and I think we all are able to tap into, is that just the deep sense of consciousness and conscious awareness, because there's so many things in life that we were conditioned into that just become such a deep-seated part of us that we may not realize is keeping us from being able to harness our personal power. And so by becoming aware of some of the things that keep me from really honoring my truth and being really connected to myself, which I believe is also that really, really building that connection with the divine, and being able to navigate that in a way that is conscious and with awareness and space to say, you know, this is a choice I've been making, and really explore that. Why am I making that choice? And is this choice really working for me now? You know, may have served a purpose, but as we grow and evolve, I believe they're just shedding periods where we realize this something that's been a part of my conditioning isn't really honoring my sense of empowerment. And so how do I change that? How do I shift this in a direction that feels more healthy for one, but more in alignment of who I am?
Yeah, and you use the word conscious awareness, which is a term that I use a lot too. Can you put like a definition on that for those listeners that might not be aware of these terms that we use as spiritual practitioners?
To me, it's something that we discover and experience. It's hard to say, to give you like a definition that can help you analyze and understand it on kind of a cerebral level, but it's something I believe that is to be experienced in the being. And for me is just there's a calm to it. There's a space to it. I feel like my energetic being is taking up more room than my thoughts and feelings. And so that I become so much more spacious to hold these things that I'm less identified with them. I can see them for what they are and just kind of observe, right? And from that space of observation, I can make choices. I can make decisions that are not of the mind or of the body response or whatever the nervous system experience we have. It's kind of like taking a backseat from your conditioning, and going, what's going on here? And I think that component itself, the curiosity, gives me a very gentle place to kind of hold this stuff, and so that I can really be loving with what's going on. And if I sit with something and say, this isn't working, then I can make a different choice. But if I sit with it and go, I'm okay with this for now, I can make that choice.
And detachment would probably be a pretty good word to describe that. It's like this space that anyone can tap into, because this is what I feel is our true nature, this space of peace and openness and tranquility, for you to look at the things that are going on in your life and not have those gut emotional reactions or nervous system reactions that pop up and tend to like color or alter or obscure that decision making, right?
The detachment, I think, is a good term, but for me, I would say I'm not really detached. I'm just more aware. There's more space for me to embody these things. And so that it's still happening. It's still part of Jesse, right? But I'm looking at it through a different lens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for that. I want to circle back to your experience with the 12-step programs, because I've heard before that these 12 steps that you go through, that these are channeled from greater sources, beings of light, if we want to use that word. One of the first steps is relinquishing yourself to a higher power. Can you talk about how the 12-step process in your experience aligns with this healing and light work and this whole world that we find ourselves in?
It's a loaded question, but it's good. I believe what's in the 12 steps, the core of it, comes from kind of these divinely inspired spiritual teachings that have been with us forever, right? Like a lot of the things that are taught in the program, in the 12 steps alone, like I did some kind of connecting the dots. I'm like, well, this is how the mystery schools of ancient Egypt worked, but it's been muddled. When I saw the first step, I never really felt what was conveyed in there, that I was powerless. I think the way I interpreted it was that when I use this coping mechanism, my brain and body kind of get hijacked and go haywire. And that's where I lose sense of control. But I never felt in any way that I was powerless over my condition or whatever. But there was still this training, this conditioning that I got from being in these rooms and in the programs and meetings and stuff that was still there, that said, you're worthless, you're powerless. If you try to do anything that's not 12-step related, you're going to die. And it really was that harsh. And I realized over time, wow, this is kind of the same things that these, fear-based religious dogmas are doing too. Like they're taking truth and they're putting this weird, funky bow around it, and that it doesn't feel good, But I spent a while in there. It helped me. It definitely, I think, in some ways saved my life. But I also had to do a lot of work to unravel and deprogram a lot of the stuff that was fear-based in that ideology.
And what you were saying was that first step is relinquishing willpower.
Yeah, exactly. And to find, I guess the way they put it is to rely on a higher power and It could be anything, it could be the group, which I think maybe in that point in your life is what you need, is kind of a power outside of you that can help you. If you've been making the same mistakes over and over and over, you can't quite get it right, but it's meant to be exclusively kind of this idea that this is the rest of your life. Like, you're an alcoholic, you're diseased, you have a spiritual disease, and this is your problem. And that if you don't follow our rules, that you're screwed and you'll never be happy. So that was my disconnect from it. And it took me a while to really kind of recondition myself out of that. And that was a hard process as well.
Yeah. And what you mentioned about how it's related to like this traditional religious dogma and these religions, the church and things like that, it definitely makes sense, because a lot of the folks I talk to and what I hear in the world talk about how it's very oppressive and fear-based, and there's a rigidness to what they expect out of you. You need to do something. You're not inherently saved. You're not inherently at peace or aligned with your truth. There needs to be something that you need to do or believe in or act on that kind of separates you from that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the reality, I think, is I've always known intuitively on this deep level that I don't need to do anything to experience and be connected to the divine. We are the divine and everything around us is, but it's this human twist that tends to be put on these things. It can be a big distortion to that truth. And I think that's where a lot of issues come in, where there's fear mongering or really rigid structures. And but I think they can be useful in really hard times. But I also think, hey, there's got to be a different way. I just don't maybe know what that is right now.
I mean, as we're talking, I'm thinking back to how you were describing your story in the treatment facility. It was a pretty low, right? I mean, because this is really at the depths of the abuse and everything. So to experience this divine energy, this beautiful technique that you were basically being gifted there in that moment, to have that at that point in your life, and to say, it's almost like you were being welcomed with open arms, like, we love you, this is who you are. It's like, that's where the two sides are just really incongruent. You were there, you were basically at the depths of that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great way to put it. And yeah, I wasn't doing anything in particular to make that happen, right? I think I was desiring change, and I think I kind of had some like, God help me moments, and divine came through in a way I didn't expect. But I think part of me, and that can be another one of those things that was a trap for me, is I believed that's why it happened, because of that particular circumstance and structure that was there. And, maybe it helped facilitate it, but it wasn't the end all be all.
Do you think that it's possible to experience that without going to that low of a low point? Do you think that anyone really in whatever point in their spiritual journey would be able to maybe apply willpower and focus in and on whatever avenue and just open themselves up to this energy, this truth, this knowing, this divine being?
I think people do, through different techniques, spiritual techniques, meditation can induce similar states. I understand, I think about Eckhart Tolle's awakening, being on the park bench, and he was at a low, like that was his experience. But then I think of other people like the channeler Bashar. He wasn't necessarily at a low in his life. He was just doing his own thing and had this UFO contact experience, and that was his awakening. So it comes in all shapes and colors, but I think maybe the impact it can have for someone coming out of that depth of a low may be more impactful. I don't know, or maybe just have a different substance to it.
Right. Well, Eckhart Tolle, I know his story is he was basically so distraught with his life and his sense of self, that he said, I can't bear to live with myself anymore. And that was the moment of spontaneity that we're talking about in these experiences, where like that poked his awareness to start looking at, well, what does it mean? Who is the myself that I can't live with anymore? And so for him, it kind of just exploded from there. And I would like to start addressing those folks that are going through this period of waking up, like who you help with in your services. What does that spiritual life look like for you, in your opinion, of living more at peace, living more joyfully, and how do you get there?
Well, I think for me, it's been a culmination of things, and really just finding what works for you at any period of your life. Because I've gone through periods where meditation was it. I went through periods where being involved in A was it. And then I went through periods where, I kind of let a lot of tools go, and I just started to learn to really induce that feeling within myself and just start to kind of allow myself to be okay regardless of using a tool or not using a tool, and that I'm still a spiritual being at my core, and that how can I accept myself as I am without having to change myself through the use of any tools. And I think it really depends. But what works for me today is to really acknowledge that part of myself on a daily basis. I find my way of connecting with spirit consciously. Sometimes I pick up my tools. I have a lot of different things I've learned over the years that are helpful, and they all come into play at different times in my life. So I think being open to everything is what really works for me. With my clients, is helping them to connect with those things and providing those tools that are going to help for the time being as you learn to navigate your spiritual life and figure out along the way, hey, what's really going to work for you now in this period of your life, because you're ever evolving,
Do you find any techniques specifically that stand out as like, yeah, this seems to work in a lot of the clients that I bring it to, and they seem to resonate with these techniques?
Good question. Yeah. Somatic work is really powerful. I think not necessarily to connect spiritually, but for healing. To connect with oneself spiritually, we can just explore that space, that even just having that awareness can really be life-changing for people. And then also like doing the deep dives. Who am I? What do I like? What do I dislike? What do I believe in? What do I stand for? And it really just, exploring all those facets of who we are.
There's no prerequisites to that, right?
No, not at all.
And you said before that was somatic healing?
Yeah, somatic work. People call it embodiment work. But somatic means roughly of the body. Part of that is learning to shift out of that kind of mental, cerebral focus of life and start to really connect with what's happening in the body. And that way we become more aware of where we store emotions, what energies are we experiencing in the body, and learn to work with ourselves in a more kind of holistic type way. And I believe that once we do that, we're also harnessing our intuitive faculties more, because that's also happening in this space, and that we're just really being in touch with all of our energy and really exploring various bits of information that we might not be aware of when we're so mind focused, which our culture is, Western culture especially.
I definitely resonate with that. I mean, that's kind of been my journey over the past year or so, just consciously being aware of this path that I'm on. And so to shift out of the mind and into more of this natural being that, like you described, I resonated with as well. It's like I always knew that it was there. I could always feel it, whether it was way, way, way back in the background that I just have to really dig deep to get to, or these days where it's like, it's right here. I could touch it. I could feel it. It's at my disposal. It's who I am. Right.
Beautifully said.
Yeah. Thank you. That's kind of like the theme for a lot of people's journeys and healing right now, is to get to that point, because that's where I feel, and let me know your thoughts, is where the peace is. That's where our happiness is. A lot of acceptance happens there too, unconditional acceptance with our life, situations, relationships. Like from that place, it's beautiful living, right?
Yeah, that's great. And what that makes me think of is like the more we continue to just get at those parts that are really distorting to our reality, as we build a new framework around that, we can actually choose to be peace. We can choose to be in that serenity and connect with that space consciously. And it becomes more and more effortless the more we put into ourselves and start to discover that space that's always been there, and let some of that conditioning and all that really intense gravity that comes with our emotional lives, you know, and our conditioning, to let that stuff go.
And it's kind of like a building of a momentum, right? It's like if you keep making those choices, eventually what was once a hard decision day to day becomes easier and easier and easier until it's so effortless that you don't even have to think about it. The problems that we tend to experience in life sometimes, like you've had a lot of big problems and situations to overcome within yourself personally and in your life situation too. Is there anything that either you've experienced with your clients or in your own life, or just kind of tapping into your intuition, that is too big to overcome?
Wow. I think one thing that comes to mind is really trying to figure it all out, you know, like that big problem that, hey, if I have it all figured out, I'm going to be okay, or whatever that is. And I think that's a problem I've learned to let go of, at least. And I think by just relinquishing it as a problem, that's my solution there. But when I get into that kind of seeking the answer to everything or predicting my future, that's a problem I don't want to wrestle with anymore.
It's kind of, well, you spoke before about like that mind cerebral perspective that I think all of us are kind of working out of right now, but it's points where you're trying to over conceptualize or overthink this process that you're going through of reconnecting back to your nature, right? Like that would be the one thing that is worth letting go and just saying, I don't know where I'm headed, but I know that where I'm headed is a good place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only is it a good place, but, you know, I can trust myself now. You know, I can trust everything that I've been able to understand about myself and my connection to the divine, that, you know, everything will be okay.
Everything will be okay.
Oh, yeah. Even when it's not.
What does that saying say on your mug there?
Work your magic.
Work your magic.
I try to remember that when I have my morning coffee or when I'm sitting down trying to do like computer stuff, and to try to connect with that element.
Oh, I love it, man. It's like this magical journey too. I mean, I feel like a lot of people use that term to describe this, call it a spiritual journey, call it a healing journey, whatever you want. But going back to that difference between the mind and the cerebral perspective versus this more wider, greater, peaceful sense of perspective of awareness, is that there's a magic to it. There's an energy, there's an excitement to this, to rediscovering yourself. And this is kind of where we're all headed. One final question before we sign off is, to those that are kind of working through this process and this journey, is there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to address to those people, like call it techniques, guidance, words of support or affirmation, anything at all?
Sure. This is something I've been coming back to a lot, especially over the last year or so, is to learn to kind of be, for myself, and maybe someone will take from this, but knowing that I'm ever evolving and that things that might have worked for me yesterday might not work for me today, and that I can lean into that unknowing and still be able to find myself in that and trust that I will get what I need and be guided to what I need, whether I have the answer or not. Like, to be able to lean into that trust that I'm okay as I grow and evolve, and that I don't have to put any kind of rules around that, you know.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
Sure. You're welcome.
Jesse, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you and these wonderful stories and different techniques too. So talk to us about what you do. Where can people find you? What's your contact info? Everything will be down linked in the description of the episode, but talk to us.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me and asking all these questions. I appreciate your presence with this. So I'm Jesse Prejean. I'm a spiritual coach, teacher, psychic medium. If you want to see what I do, you can go to my website, jesseprejean.com. I also have an Instagram, JP_intuitive_healing. A lot of what I do these days is I really have been focusing on the spiritual coaching aspect and the mentoring aspect, which I love. And it's really just great to see people change and transform and be part of that journey. So I get a great deal of fulfillment from that part. I do teach mediumship development courses, evidential mediumship specifically. I'm also an energy healer. Like I said, Reiki was my first tool. And after having that kind of energetic awakening, that's always been somewhere on my path. I teach Reiki certification courses, all levels. I also teach a modality of energy healing called Seishin. I also am an intuitive, so I break out the tarot cards and I do readings here and there as well. So I guess a jack of all trades, you could say, in the spiritual healing arts. And I'm always open to, you can email me directly, jesseprejean@outlook.com. It's a great way to just ask questions and, get to know each other.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. Jesse Prejean, it was wonderful to have you. I so appreciate having you on here. It was a great time.
Thank you for listening to Angels Around Us. You can find William at his website, yourdivinity.org, which includes contact info, one-on-one sessions, events, and more.